Professor Savage was closely involved in clinical trials and studies and various research products. By way of further examples, there are two I'll mention, and then a couple of that we'll look at the documents. There is a reference in a document authored by Dr. Ritzer, which suggests that in 1983, Professor Savage was carrying out what's described as virological studies on patients treated with suspect batches of factor VIII concentrate. And then, to illustrate the width of the work that Professor Savage was undertaking, he appears to have been involved in encouraging colleagues and himself to enter patients into a trial on AZT later on in the course of the 1980s. Obviously, a particular area of interest to him was the impact of the use of heat-treated concentrates. And there are two papers published in the Lancet in 1985, which show some of the work that he was undertaking in that respect. There's a range of different references for them, so I'm not sure what version Henry has. Henry, could we try PRSE 0001848, please? Excellent, that's the one. That's the Lancet, July 1985, and we can see it's entitled Transmission of Non-A, Non-B Hepatitis by Heat-Treated Factor VIII Concentrate. And there are a number of authors, including Professor Minucci, who was referred to by Dr. Colvin yesterday, and Professor Savage. We can perhaps, if we go to the next page, Henry, under the heading Patients and Method, we can see that 5 different lots of a heated factor VIII concentrate, Haemophilia T, were used in this study. Each lot was made from pooled plasma collected in 1982, 1983 and 1984 from approximately 5,000 North American plasmapheresis donors. And then under the heading Patients, haemophilia centres in Milan, Heidelberg, London and Paris enrolled patients who needed treatment with factor VIII concentrate. Only patients highly susceptible to post-transfusion hepatitis were considered, i.e. those who had never received blood or blood products, so previously untreated patients. And then there were various other criteria for inclusion. And then we're told that 21 patients with severe, moderate or mild haemophilia A met these criteria and gave their written informed consent. We don't have the underlying documents which relating to the trial, but that's the report that they gave written informed consent. We can see under the heading results that 21 patients were included, 13 were followed up regularly, 7 missed some critical visits, 1 was followed up and then defaulted. And then if we go to the next page, under the heading discussion, we can see the primary purpose of the study was to assess whether hepatitis could be transmitted by heat-treated factor VIII concentrate. The enrolment of only patients previously untreated with blood or blood products is of critical importance for the accurate assessment of post-transfusion hepatitis. Our decision to select only first exposure patients meant that only a small number of patients with haemophilia A could be recruited. And then we can perhaps just go to the concluding paragraph on the right-hand column. Our finding that non-A, non-B hepatitis is transmitted by a heated concentrate, so that was the outcome, should not be taken as evidence that heat treatment is equally ineffective for other viral agents, and then reference there made to AIDS. So that's one example of one of the studies that Professor Savage was involved with, and clearly some patients under his care, it would seem, previously untreated patients were provided with this particular heat-treated concentrate for the purposes of the study. We can then see at, should be RLIT 0000186, Henry. This is a further study reported in the Lancet in September of 1985, headed Wet Heating for Safer Factor VIII Concentrate. It's authored by Dr. Kernoff, Dr. Miller, Professor Savage, Dr. Machin, Dr. Dewar, and Professor Preston. And we can see there, this is said, it's a letter to the Lancet on this occasion, after a first exposure to large donor pool unheated factor VIII concentrates of either commercial or volunteer NHS origin, acute non-A, non-B hepatitis is of virtual certainty, implying the invariable contamination of these products. Although heat treatment probably eliminates the risk of HTLV3 transmission, the most commonly used heating process, we see there it's a form of dry heating, seems to have little or no effect in reducing the risk of non-A, non-B hepatitis. Such infections may have serious long-term consequences. Preliminary results for a prospective multi-centre clinical study indicate that wet heating is more effective in reducing the risk of post-transfusion non-A, non-B hepatitis. And we can see there that this is concerned with a different product, Profilate heat-treated, prepared by Alpha, prepared from American commercial plasma pools, 5,000 to 32,000 donors per batch. They refer to the study protocol. Patients admitted have never previously received factor VIII concentrate, although they may have been treated with other blood products. And then it describes the taking of serial blood samples. 18 patients have been admitted to the study so far. They've been followed up for 42 weeks. All but one, an Italian, were treated in England. We're told 11 had no prior exposure to any blood product. 7 had previously received blood, plasma, or cryoprecipitate up to a maximum of 56 donor units. 9 different batches of Profilate have been used, only 1 patient having been exposed to more than 1 batch. Total dosage has varied considerably. None of the patients has shown serological evidence of acute infection with hepatitis A, B, cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr virus. They're all seronegative for HTLV3. However, acute non-A, non-B hepatitis has developed in 4, and details of that are given. And it says that they're examining the reasons, and there's a suggestion, no more than that at that stage of the study, that the product carries a lesser overall risk of non-A, non-B transmission than either unheated or dry heated concentrates. So those are 2 of the particular pieces of work that Professor Savage was involved in terms of research by 1985. He published later in 1987 a further article in the British Journal of Haematology about the reduced risk of non-A, non-B hepatitis after first exposure to wet heated factor VIII concentrate, so a follow-up. And obviously we've seen references to some of the earlier research that he was involved in the earlier part of the 80s in terms of the early heat-treated products. We do see that when we get to the early 1990s, we see Professor Savage raising concerns about patient consent and the use of patient data. And that emerges in a letter which he wrote to the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. It's OXUH 0002131_007. It's to the clinical nurse specialist at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre, and it's a response to correspondence concerning an 8Y study. And he says this, as at the 28th of February 1990, I have some reservations concerning sending you samples for hepatitis C, particularly in view of possible litigation and the ethics of the clinical trial. I feel that before one can take such samples, one should secure a revised clinical trial protocol which should be cleared by the local ethical committee, and a patient consent form should be prepared. A further issue involves what we tell the patient/parents regarding the test and the interpretation of the results we receive. As you can see, this whole area raises a number of issues which have to be resolved now, and if not, could lead to embarrassment at a later stage. And he expresses the hope that Mrs. Fletcher will be able to discuss these matters with Dr. Ritzer. So again, we haven't at the moment been able to track through further correspondence to get a full sense of what this issue went to, but it is here in 1990 an expression of concern about the importance of appropriate ethical committee approval for and patient consent. How it's resolved, or if it was resolved, we're yet to ascertain. The issue of consent in relation to either the holding or the sharing of patient data is something which became in the years that followed an area of some dispute between Professor Savage and others within UKHCDO. I'll just give a couple of examples. That there's a whole chain of correspondence and communications at meetings. But we can see if we look at HCDO 0000266046, that we're getting here to the early 2000s, so this is December 2002, and it's a letter from Professor Savage to Dr. Hay, headed data protection issues in the UKHCDO. There's a sense, something of a backstory to this when one looks at the UKHCDO minutes. But we can see in the second paragraph, he is essentially saying he hasn't agreed to submit data to UKHCDO, and he records his views on data protection issues being well known to most of the audience at the meeting. That's to his fellow directors, and little would have been, he says, gained by reiterating the obvious. And we get a sense of what the underlying issue was if we look at correspondence that Professor Savage had with Professor Hill, who was the then chair of UKHCDO. Henry, it's HCDO 0000266126. And again, for present purposes, I think I can just look at the third paragraph, where he says this: as you know, I have for many years withheld sending data to the UKHCDO due to the fact that personal data has been used in manual systems. No patient consent has been obtained, and no mandate from the Department of Health to the UKHCDO to collect this data has been made available. To that end, in 1998, when the Data Protection Act came into force, I informed my chief executive of the trust in writing that as data controller, I considered the legal risk to the trust of supplying these data to the UKHCDO as unacceptably high. And you will have seen, and we looked at a couple of examples with Dr. Colvin yesterday, it was undoubtedly standard practice throughout the 1980s and indeed earlier in the 1970s for information about individual patients to be sent first of all to Oxford, and then when the National Haemophilia database was established in Manchester, to Manchester. And an issue which is a recurrent theme at a number of UKHCDO meetings is this issue that we see being ventilated here by Professor Savage, whether that was a matter that required patient consent, and if so, whether that patient consent had been obtained. And I won't go through the detail of the backwards and forwards of the communications in correspondence and in meetings, but as at 2006, we can see that, at least from St Thomas's perspective, the issue is not resolved. So we'll just look at that. HCDO 602_032. This is a letter from St Thomas's, Guy's and St Thomas's medical director and Caldecott guardian. It's copied to Professor Savage. It's headed Request for Immediate Submission of Patient Identifiable Data to the National Haemophilia Database. Pausing there, so we're not talking about de-identified data, but identifiable data. And the second paragraph says the Trust is eager to assist the National Haemophilia Database in its important work. However, you will understand our concern that we're being asked to disclose confidential patient data without either the permission of patients or a clear assurance that the relevant regulations are being complied with. I won't go on to deal with the rest of the letter, and so it's not a legal issue that you will necessarily need to resolve, but clearly, thematically, the question of patient consent is one which manifests itself over the years in a number of different ways, and this is one such manifestation. Dealing more broadly with Professor Savage's involvement with UKHCDO, as I've already indicated, he was confirmed as a reference centre director and attended in that capacity from October 1979, and he was certainly at most of the reference centre director meetings throughout the 1980s. He held a number of positions within UKHCDO on committees or working groups. And again, it is clear from the material that we've seen that he is on a number of occasions at odds with his fellow directors on a range of issues. For your purposes, sir, what may be most useful to observe is his description of how UKHCDO operated in those critical early years of the 1980s. And for that, we need to go back to his evidence to the Archer inquiry. So, Henry, that's ARCH 5011. And if we go, please, to page 134, Henry. Oh no, sorry, could we go earlier than that? Could we go to page 132? So he says this: I talk about the UKHCDO in considerable depth. That's a reference to his written statement about its composition, its function. Essentially, I compared it more or less with a club rather than a formal organisation, because it really didn't have any affiliations with any of the learned societies or with the Royal Colleges. It was not part of the NHS. It was not even funded by the NHS. It was there really as, I tried to think of it as best I put in legal terms. So I came up with this concept of unincorporated association of interested haemophilia physicians. That was about the closest I could get because its legal status was +/-0. I think quite a lot of the information, there was a lot of information that was fed back as and when required on an ad hoc basis on a number of instances. So presumably he's talking there about information sharing from reference centre directors more widely. And then he goes on to talk about another issue. So if we turn over the page, Henry, to your page 134. We can pick it up at the bottom of the page. He's prompted, you were talking about UKHCDO, and he says, yes, as I say, there were really 10 main players, and of course he was one such player in the sense he was a reference centre director from 79 onwards. And those players were those centres that were considered to be the largest and the most influential. I'm not necessarily talking about influential at a district level or even at a regional level, but mostly at a national level. It was not, shall we say, very much sort of the type of meeting where one could discuss things. It was really information exchange. They set up their own working parties. They presented. In fact, I headed up a few working parties and one did bits and pieces. But really, at the end of the day, it didn't make much of a contribution because it was very difficult to get anything published that had UKHCDO on it, because invariably it was going to be statistical. It was not really going to influence any form of general medical people. And then he, skipping over a couple of lines, he says it was very much sort of a DIY job. Let us keep the smaller haemophilia centres, which are made up 80 to 90% of the body, with information about what currently is being done nationally on a national basis. in terms of the type of things relating to blood product safety, some concerns about that with the general people, but normally they followed what came from the top. And then if we go down towards the bottom of that page, he says, and it's unclear here whether he's talking simply here about UKHCDO or more generally about the medical profession. He says, I think that there should have been far more stringent and dominant leadership from the doctor's side than had currently existed. It was very much, let us cobble together some sort of compromise so everybody is happy, which was fine if you are not playing around with a lethal disease. And then Lord Archer puts to him a suggestion that patients were simply listening to doctors. And he says this, I think it's asking a little bit too much to put the responsibility onto the patients' backs and to say they insisted because they were advised or they should have been advised. And then he goes back to talking about UKHCDO at the bottom of the page. We had very little feedback as a member of the UKHCDO from any other committees, and maybe he's talking there about committees such as the Committee on Safety of Medicines or other national committees, particularly the more influential committees, because there was an arrangement of an unofficial delegation whereby the chairman, and this here is Professor Bloom, who sat on all these committees and was so busy changing hats throughout the course of the day from one committee to another, he was really informally delegated to be a representative to explain the feelings of the UKHCDO or his interpretation of the feelings of the UKHCDO, which we never found out about because we never saw any meetings back, and we had very few reports back about actually what he said, what they answered and what actions were taking. We had no idea. So in fact, we were functioning more in a sort of information-fed vacuum, and for my purpose, I have a problem with that. And then he goes on to talk about his own decision. That is why I decided to go the heat-treated way much earlier, about 2 or 3 years earlier than anybody else, because I was not prepared to wait around for somebody to tell me that it would be better to use a Crown Immune-approved product that I knew was contaminated in preference to a product that I knew had gone through formal FDA-type testing, etc., etc. So we swung into that much earlier to the concern of lots of people. So that's Professor Savage's take on how UKHCDO operated, and in particular the role of its chairman and his relationship with all these other committees in what was obviously a key period. Professor Savage had some involvement with the Haemophilia Society. His predecessor, Professor Ingram, had been probably a more key player within the Haemophilia Society from the records we've seen. Professor Savage, from time to time, was awarded research grants. We saw one example from the Haemophilia Society, and applied for and obtained donations or assistance with funds from the Haemophilia Society. He also spoke at Haemophilia Society events, attended the Haemophilia Society annual conference, but there doesn't appear to be quite the same level of involvement in terms of influencing Haemophilia Society publications or positions as we've seen, at least so far with Professor Bloom, and we may see with other clinicians. There is also some evidence in the documents of Professor Savage having patients who were attending Treloar's school, and there is the correspondence between Professor Savage and patients of his at Treloar's. Again, it's typical of some of the communications that we've seen in relation to other centres, and of what I think it was Professor Dr. Colvin described as shared care, so that there are a patient at Treloar's who will be receiving care under Dr. Arenstam or Dr. Wassef during term time, and then reverting back to the care of the Haemophilia Centre in the school holidays. In terms of participation in litigation, Professor Savage's evidence to the Archer inquiry as to the extent to which he had a role in any of the big pieces of litigation his answers are unclear. But we can see from one HCDO meeting some of the issues that arose in relation to the HIV litigation from his perspective. It's HCDO 0000271_014. If we go to the next page, please. These are the minutes of a meeting of the AIDS group of Haemophilia Centre directors in February 1990. You'll have seen that it was Dr. Savage who suggested, or seemingly suggested, that there should be an AIDS group of some kind in that December 84 meeting, and he sat on the AIDS group thereafter. There is a reference to litigation at the bottom of the page. And I should say this is a meeting at which members, someone on behalf of doctors' defence unions attended. And it's Dr. Savage who at the bottom of the page raises the point that one member of the AIDS group was acting as an expert on behalf of the plaintiffs and wondered whether it was acceptable for him to take part in the group's discussion on litigation and the defence of the main statement of claim. And that was a reference to Dr. Arenstam. And there is thereafter a discussion about, which reveals that a number of different members of the group are involved in one form or another in relation to parts of the HIV litigation. There is a reference, again, if we go to the next page, please. In the second paragraph, this is said, with regard to health authorities' defence to the re-amended statement of claim, Dr. Savage said that he'd been using heat-treated factor 8 as early as 1983, and we've seen it may even have been late 1982 in terms of early trials, and he was trying to get the defence's statement amended as it said heat-treated factor 8 was not used until the end of 1984. We've not been able to unearth any more detailed involvement on Professor Savage's part in the HIV litigation beyond what we see described in this meeting. We don't have, for example, the equivalent of the litigation report that we have from Professor Bloom or the report that we have from Dr. Ritzer, which we'll be looking at tomorrow during the Oxford presentation.
Well, Professor Bloom, I should say, his involvement was as an expert witness.
Yes.
And it's, if what Dr. Savage wished to contribute was that he had been using heat-treated factor 8, that makes him, if anything, a factual witness.
Yes, we'll see.
And there may be a difference in how the two are supposed to relate. After all, experts are not supposed to be on any side at all.
So that's obviously absolutely right. We may see tomorrow with Dr. Ritzer that that distinction wasn't always easy to maintain because there were doctors who were being asked to act as experts who had obviously had direct decision-making roles in relation to the very decisions that were the subject of the litigation. And indeed, we can see that from the discussion here. It said that Dr. Arenstam was acting as an expert on behalf of the plaintiffs, but then there's reference to there being litigation in the Wessex region, and then there's reference to Dr. Jones acting, I think, as or one of the doctors acting for the plaintiffs in Scotland. But of course, there was litigation against the Newcastle Health Authority going on in England. So the position in terms of roles in litigation for these doctors was, I think, at best a pretty muddled one.
Well, there may be, I don't know enough to say definitively, but there may be a conflict of interest somewhere.
Yes. that's possible. But
and what would matter then would be whether, and it's entirely not for me, whether that was disclosed in the litigation.
Yes, the matter that may be for you is the use you put, or what you make of the reports that were produced by some doctors. So we have, for example, obviously Professor Bloom's report. There is a report from Dr. Ritzer that we'll look at tomorrow. There's a detailed document that was prepared by Dr. Peter Jones that we will look at some point during the course of this tranche of hearings. And you may wish to consider, when you look at those materials, the capacity in which the author was providing them.
Yes.
But we don't have very much more from Professor Savage in terms of his involvement than what we've been able to piece together from this. So those are the documents I wanted to show you in relation to Professor Savage and St Thomas's. As I say, that there's a lot that doesn't emerge from the documentation, in particular in terms of information provision to patients about risks, how and when the testing for both HIV and hepatitis C was undertaken, what information was given and how to patients about testing, about diagnosis, about treatment. And those are gaps that you will need to fill undoubtedly through looking at the individual witness statements from patients who were treated at St Thomas's, and such information as you can glean from their narratives and from the medical records that they produce. So there is it's an incomplete jigsaw, clearly, in terms of the picture that the contemporaneous documents show us. The last thing, therefore, is just to play 3 very short clips from a 1985 documentary. So it's the 1985 Bad Blood documentary. It's a World in Action documentary, I think. And we have 3 very short clips, which are interviews with Professor Savage during that documentary. So I'll just play those and then make a couple of observations. Henry, could we have those 3 clips?
Another long-standing supporter of the use of imported Factor VIII is Dr. Geoffrey Savage of St Thomas's Hospital in London.
To remove treatment or to restrict treatment in these patients is to take away their independent lifestyle, their possibility of gaining employment and holding down employment, their possibilities of having a family, and of being able to offer a sensible contribution to society.
That is the risk that, in fact, someone who has the AIDS virus could transmit it to their wife or girlfriend or to a child.
The figures amongst haemophilics are very scanty, but generally speaking, I think from American data, one is thinking in terms of about 5% transmission rate to sexual partners.
So it's obviously a very real risk.
It is a risk.
The first evidence of that risk in Britain was confirmed this weekend. The wife of a Newcastle haemophiliac has contracted AIDS.
And then should be a 3rd clip, Henry.
Certainly in terms of Factor VIII, there will be a continuing shortfall until the supply of material copes with the demand of the material and the projected demand, and thus there will always be a use for commercially available material in this country until these conditions are satisfied.
So those are the 3 short clips that we have of Professor Savage talking on the documentary in 1985. Just 2 short observations from me in relation to the first and the 3rd clip. In the first clip, you'll see he clearly regarded the ability to treat with concentrates as important, and you may wish to consider whether the question he was there contemplating was the stark question of treatment or no treatment, rather than the question of whether there could have been modified or different forms of treatment. In relation to the 3rd clip, you will see there his observations about the role for commercial material and essentially the issue of self-sufficiency and there being an insufficient supply of NHS material appears to be what he's alluding to in the 3rd clip. That's all we have from that documentary from Professor Savage. So that's the material in relation to St Thomas's.
Yes, well, thank you very much. that concludes the work today. I said the work, I mean the session for today. The work continues for all of us. But what do we have tomorrow?
Tomorrow, sir, we have the presentation on Oxford Haemophilia Centre.
And do you have any sense when you might be likely to conclude that?
My sense, sir, is that it's likely to take most of the day, but ought to conclude by the end of the day.
By the end of the day, you mean?
4:15, 4:30.
So that's some indication for those of you who are planning to be here tomorrow, when you might need to make, if you travel from some distance. It's the start of what used to be the weekend before COVID, and just so that you know where we are likely to be. So tomorrow, 10 o'clock.
Yes, sir.